Meg Calloway did not knock. She pushed open the door to Caleb Weston's ranch house with her shoulder, walked straight to the desk buried under 5 years of someone else's lies, and dropped 2 documents on top of everything else. Then she turned around and looked at the man standing in his own doorway, staring at her like she was a ghost he had personally buried. And she said, "You're being robbed, Mr. Weston, and the man doing it has been signing your paperwork for 4 years." Then she stepped aside so he could see the boy standing behind her, and she watched Caleb Weston's face go completely still. If this story finds you today, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end. The wagon had been rolling since before sunrise, and Danny had not complained once, which meant he was either asleep or thinking. And when Meg glanced over at him, she found him awake, sitting straight, watching the Texas landscape go past, with the concentrated attention he gave everything he considered worth understanding. "We're almost there," she said. "I know." He'd been saying that for the last hour. He had memorized the map she'd shown him in Santa Fe, and was tracking their progress against landmarks she hadn't even noticed. He was 5 years old. He did things like that. Meg looked back at the road and said nothing. She had been rehearsing this moment for 300 miles. Not what she would say. She'd decided that much in Albuquerque, in a hotel room that smelled like dust while Danny slept, and she sat at the small table and made herself be honest about why she'd signed the placement papers the moment she saw Caleb Weston's name. She had rehearsed her face, the specific expression she intended to wear when she stepped down onto his land and he saw her, and understood she had come deliberately. Professional, unreachable, certain. She'd practiced it in every window reflection since Santa Fe. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and Meg's rehearsed expression almost failed her entirely, because the place looked exactly like the man she remembered. No excess, no softness. Every post and plank doing exactly what it was built to do, and nothing more. She had told herself 5 years was long enough to forget the specific quality of Caleb Weston's presence. She had been incorrect. He came around the side of the barn before the wagon stopped moving. He saw her, and he stopped walking. Meg climbed down without waiting for help. "Don't," she said quietly to Danny, who had already started to jump, and she lifted him down herself and set him on the ground, and then straightened up and looked at Caleb Weston across 20 feet of baked Texas dirt, and did not let her face do anything she hadn't decided in advance. "Miss Calloway." His voice was exactly the same. She had hoped it would be different, lower, or rougher, or older in some way that would have made him a stranger. "Mr. Weston, the agency said you needed someone to go through your land records. I do that work." She reached into her satchel and produced 2 sheets of paper and held them out. "And before we discuss anything else, you need to look at these." He crossed the yard. He took the papers from her hand without touching her fingers. Deliberate, she noticed, and looked down at them. She watched his face. She was good at watching faces. 8 years of working with documents that people had reasons to lie about had made her skilled at the moment when a person understood they were looking at something that changed everything. Caleb Weston had that moment standing in his own yard in the July heat, with sweat at his collar and dust on his boots. He looked at the first document, then the second, then back at the first. His jaw set. "Where did you get these?" "They were in your desk, both of them, filed together as if someone had forgotten to separate them, or as if someone wanted them found eventually, when it was too late for you to do anything about it." She paused. "The one on the left is your original title deed for the Western Quarter. The one on the right is a duplicate that transfers that same quarter to a holding company registered in Austin. It's dated 8 months ago. The notary stamp belongs to Harlan Price. Caleb looked up. The ink is wrong, Meg said. The paper has been artificially aged. The stamp impression is too deep, pressed by someone nervous, not by someone who stamps documents 40 times a day. I noticed it in 30 seconds, which means anyone I show it to in a territorial courthouse will notice it in less. She met his eyes. You're being robbed, Mr. Weston. Legally, carefully, and almost successfully. The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. Price handles every land transaction in this county, Caleb said. I know. He's been my attorney since I bought this property. I know that too. Then he has access to every document He stopped. Something moved behind his eyes, fast and ugly. The specific look of a man understanding, not just that he'd been betrayed, but calculating exactly how long it had been happening. The water survey, he said. Last spring, he sent a man to do a water survey on the Western Quarter. What did they find? Caleb looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger. Something quieter and more dangerous. An underground aquifer, largest in the county, the surveyor said, enough to supply the whole region through a 10-year drought. He looked back at the papers in his hand. I told Price about it. I trusted... He stopped again. He filed the duplicate deed 2 months after the survey, Meg said. I'll need the original county filings to prove it, which means I need to get to the records office in Cutter's Creek before Price realizes someone is looking. But yes, that's what he was after. My water. Your water, which in a drought year is worth more than the land itself. Caleb looked at the papers for another moment, then folded them with steady hands and held them back out to her. You'd better keep these. I intend to. She took them and turned to find Danny had moved 3 feet closer to the barn without her noticing, his attention fixed on something beyond the open doors with a magnetic focus he applied to anything he had decided was worth investigating. Danny, her voice came out sharper than she intended. There are horses. He turned to look at her with dark eyes. The boy had never learned to be indirect. Meg had sometimes thought it was a mercy, and sometimes thought it was going to be the end of them both. The wrapping's too tight, Danny told Caleb. It'll cut off the blood. Caleb crouched down to the boy's level. He did it slowly, the way a man moves when he is operating on instinct, and his instincts are telling him to be careful. You know horses? Then he looked past Caleb at the barn. Can I see the gray one? The leg needs to be rewrapped looser or she won't heal right. Caleb stood up slowly. He looked at Meg. She looked back at him, and she kept her face exactly where she'd put it in Santa Fe. Professional and unreachable. And she watched him understand that she had come here on purpose. And she watched him decide, in real time, what kind of man he intended to be about it. Come on, then, Caleb said to Danny. Let's have a look at that leg. Meg watched them cross the yard together. Her son's stride 3 to every one of Caleb's. Danny talking in the precise and serious way he talked about anything involving animals. Caleb listening, the way she'd forgotten he listened. Like the person speaking was the only thing in his field of vision. She picked up her bag and went inside to work. The desk was worse than she'd expected, and better than she'd feared. Worse because the disorder was deliberate. Papers shuffled and restacked in ways designed to look like routine disorganization, while actually obscuring the sequence of specific transactions. Better because whoever had done it didn't know that Meg had spent 8 years at the Territorial Records Office and could read filing disorder the way a tracker read ground. She found 3 more anomalies in the first hour. By the time Caleb came in with Danny on his heels, both of them carrying the smell of horse and summer heat, she had built a clear enough picture to understand that Harlan Price had been working this scheme for at least 18 months. The duplicate deed was the final move. Before it came smaller maneuvers, a fence line survey that had quietly redrawn the eastern boundary by 6 feet, a grazing rights addendum buried in a routine renewal that would have given Price's holding company first claim on any mineral discovery. A tax filing discrepancy that would have been impossible to trace without the original county records. Price was not a stupid man. Stupid men didn't survive long enough in the law business to execute something this layered. He was patient and he was careful, and he had made exactly one mistake, which was filing the duplicate deed in the same folder as the original, instead of destroying the original the way he should have. Meg had been finding the one mistake for 8 years. She was very good at it. "You'll want to hear this," she said without looking up when Caleb came to stand at the edge of the desk. "I'm listening." She laid out what she'd found, piece by piece, in the order she'd found it. She used plain language, because she always used plain language with clients. Legal complexity was a tool people used to make other people feel helpless, and Meg had no patience for it. Caleb listened without interrupting, which put him in the top 10% of clients she'd ever worked with. When she finished, he said, "How long to prove it?" "With access to the county originals, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Price will have filed everything through a secondary attorney to keep his own name off the surface documents, so I'll need to trace the holding company registration back to him personally." She paused. "He'll know someone is looking the moment I walk into that records office. People talk in small counties." "Then we move fast." "I move fast," Meg said. "You stay here and act like nothing's changed. If Price thinks you found someone to investigate his paperwork, he'll accelerate his timeline and will lose the advantage of surprise." She looked up at him for the first time since he'd come inside. "Can you do that? Act like nothing's changed?" Something shifted in his expression. He knew she wasn't only talking about Price. "I've been doing it for 4 years," he said. "Didn't know Price was stealing from me. Didn't know—" He stopped. "About Danny," Meg said, flat and direct, because that was the only way she knew how to have a conversation she'd been dreading. "About Danny." He pulled a chair out and sat down across the desk from her, which was not what she'd expected. She had expected him to stand the way men stood when they were having a conversation they wanted to be able to walk away from. "I was in Santa Fe in the fall of '77. "I know when you were in Santa Fe." "I left before morning." "I know that too." "I left a note." "Amarillo," Meg said. "You had work in Amarillo. No address. No way to reply." She had memorized that note. She had burned it eventually because she was practical, not because it still mattered. And she was not going to think about which of those things was more true. "I tried to find you. I wrote to 3 different ranch outfits in Amarillo. None of them had a Caleb Weston on their crew." "I moved on before the letters would have arrived." His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I came back through Santa Fe the next spring. The boarding house woman said you'd moved." "I'd found a cheaper room." "She didn't have a forwarding address." "She didn't know one." Meg folded her hands on the desk. "I wasn't trying to disappear. I was trying to manage on a clerk's salary with—" She stopped. "With a child coming," Caleb said. "Yes." The word sat between them in the summer heat. Outside, through the open window, a horse shifted in the barn and then went quiet. Danny's voice was not audible, which meant he had either found something sufficiently interesting to occupy him or had fallen asleep, both of which were equally possible. "I'm not here to make accusations," Meg said. "You didn't know. I believe that. What I came to—" She paused, chose the next words carefully, because she had been choosing them for a long time. "He's been asking questions I don't have good answers for. About why he doesn't have a father. About why other children do." She met Caleb's eyes directly. "I thought you should have the chance to see him. What you do with that is your affair. I'm not asking you for anything. I never asked you for anything." "I know you didn't." Caleb's voice had roughened in a way she recognized, in a way she absolutely was not going to let mean anything to her at this particular moment. "That was—" He stopped. "Don't," Meg said. "I was going to say it was one of the things I remembered about you." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and the specific quality of that look was something she had successfully not thought about for 5 years, and was now, inconveniently, thinking about. "I need to ride to Cutter's Creek first thing tomorrow," she said. "I'll need a horse." "Take the roan. She's steady on the road." "Thank you." She pulled the duplicate deed from her satchel and set it between them. "Harlan Price is going to realize someone's looking. When he does, he won't come at you with a gun, Caleb. He'll come at you with paper. More paper. Different paper. Paper filed through 3 different attorneys in 3 different counties, so that by the time you trace it back to him, your land is already legally someone else's." She pressed her finger to the document. "The only thing that beats that is better paper. More thorough paper. Evidence so clean that no judge in the territory can find a reason to look away from it." "Is that what you do?" he asked. "Build cases out of paper?" "I find the one mistake," Meg said. "Everybody makes one. And then I build from there." Caleb looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, which was unusual. She could generally read people. "You're going to beat him." "I'm going to try very hard." "No." He shook his head slowly. "You're going to beat him. I can hear it." He stood up. "I'll start dinner. Danny's in the barn trying to explain to my horses why their names aren't good enough." Meg blinked. "Their names?" "Apparently the gray one should be called something more dignified." He suggested magistrate. The edge of Caleb's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one. I told him she'd probably answer to it. Meg sat alone in the quiet of the office for a moment after he'd gone, her hand flat on the desk, her eyes on the duplicate deed. She had made herself one promise before she left Santa Fe, one promise that she had kept for every mile of the journey, through the heat and the dust and the 300 miles of Texas that had tried to make her turn around. She was not going to cry. She was here to do a job. She was here to catch a thief. She was here because her son had asked a question she couldn't answer alone. And she was here because she was Margaret Calloway, and she did not run from anything, not from drought years, and not from courthouse fights, and not from the specific, inconvenient, 5 years unresolved problem of Caleb Weston's eyes when he looked at her across a room. Outside, she heard Danny's voice from the barn, serious and instructional, explaining something to a horse named Magistrate. She heard Caleb's low answer. She heard her son laugh. Margaret Calloway pressed her hand flat on the desk and breathed, and did not cry, and went back to work. She had a thief to catch before he finished stealing everything, and she had always been better with a pen than anyone had given her credit for. That was about to matter a great deal. Meg rode into Cutter's Creek before the town was fully awake. She had left before dawn, before Danny stirred, before Caleb came out of his room with his boots already on, the way he'd come out every morning, she'd observed, like a man who never fully slept, only waited for daylight to give him permission to work. She'd left a note on the desk that said, "Gone to County Records Office, back by noon. Professional, informative, nothing extra." She tied the roan to the post outside the county building and went straight to the records clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the anxious look of someone who had been told to be helpful, but not too helpful. "I need the original filing records for the Weston Ranch," she said. "All transactions from 1878 to present. Land transfers, water rights, easements, anything recorded under that property address." The clerk looked at her. "That's a significant pull, ma'am." "I know what it is." She set her credentials on the counter, her territorial records certification, her letter of engagement from the ranch, and a second letter she had written herself on hotel stationery in Albuquerque, signed with a judge's name she knew would be recognized in any county office in Texas. "I'm conducting an audit on behalf of the property owner. I have full legal standing to access those records." The clerk read everything twice. Then he went to pull the files. Meg stood at the counter and waited and watched the door and did not let herself think about the conversation she'd had with Caleb the night before, or the way Danny had fallen asleep at the dinner table with his cheek on his arm, and Caleb had looked at the boy for a long moment before quietly getting up to carry him to his cot without being asked. She did not think about any of that. She thought about ink oxidation rates and paper aging techniques and the specific way Harlan Price had pressed that notary stamp too deep. The clerk came back with 3 folders and a ledger and set them on the counter. "You can use the table in the back." "Thank you." She had been at the table for 40 minutes when the front door opened and she heard the clerk's voice shift into a register of particular deference that told her everything before she even looked up. "Mr. Price, good morning, sir." "Morning, William. I need the Caldwell easement renewal. Should be filed under March of this year." Meg did not look up. She turned a page. Harlan Price was a tall man, she noted from her peripheral vision. Well-dressed for a county seat, silver of his temples. The kind of deliberate presentation that said, "I am the most important person in any room I enter," with enough consistency that most people had stopped questioning it. He took the file from the clerk and started to leave, and then stopped. She felt him notice her. "I don't believe I know you," he said. Meg looked up. She let her expression be pleasant and blank, the expression she had perfected over 8 years of courthouse work. The expression that said, "I am a minor functionary performing a routine task," with enough conviction that most people accepted it. "Margaret Ashby," she said, giving him her mother's maiden name without hesitation. "I'm doing some research for a client in the area." "What kind of research?" "Water rights history. Drought years in this county. I'm trying to establish usage patterns." She looked back down at the ledger. "Tedious work. You know how it is." Price looked at the folders on the table. From where he stood, she knew he could see the Weston name on the top folder. She had put it there deliberately, face up, because she needed him to see it and believe it meant nothing, and because the actual document she was most interested in, the holding company registration and the secondary attorney filings, were in the middle folder, face down, under her left hand. "That's the Weston property file," Price said. "Is it?" She glanced at it with mild interest. "I pulled several files. The water table in this region crosses property lines, so I need comparison data from multiple parcels." She turned a page in the ledger without reading it. "Do you know the Weston Ranch? I understand it has significant water resources on the western quarter." A pause. Very brief. A man less practiced at watching silences would have missed it. "I handle some legal work for Mr. Weston. Nothing significant currently." Meg made a small note on the paper beside her. Meaningless words, but they looked purposeful. "Well, I won't keep you, Mr. Price. Harlan Price." "Mr. Price." She smiled the way she smiled at courthouse functionaries. Polite, dismissive, already moving on. "Have a good morning." He left. Meg waited until she heard the front door close. Then she opened the middle folder. The holding company was registered under the name Brazos Land and Water Trust, incorporated in Austin 14 months ago, 2 months after Caleb's water survey. The registered agent was a man named Theodore Galt, an attorney in Austin she'd never heard of, which meant he was either very new or very careful. The beneficial owner was listed as Anonymous Trust, which was legal and common, and told her exactly nothing about who Price was using as his financial cover. But the filing attorney for the duplicate deed transfer was Galt, and the notary on the Brazos Incorporation papers was the same stamp she'd found on the duplicate deed. Different county, same stamp. Price had used his own notary twice and hoped no one would look at both documents together. Meg sat back in her chair and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of satisfaction. Then she copied everything she needed into her own notebook, returned the folders to the clerk with a pleasant thank you, and walked out into the July heat to find that her roan had been untied from the post and was standing loose in the middle of the street. She stopped on the sidewalk. The roan looked at her with an expression that suggested this was not her idea. Meg crossed to the horse, took the reins, and checked the tie. Not broken, not worn through. Cut. Cleanly, recently, with something sharp. She retied the horse to a different post, took note of the 2 men leaning against the building across the street, who were looking at everything except her, and rode back to the ranch at a pace that was not quite a gallop, because she needed to think, and she could not think at a gallop. Price had made his second mistake. He'd moved too fast, which meant he was afraid. Afraid men made additional mistakes. She needed him to make one more. Caleb was at the fence line when she came through the gate, Danny beside him holding a coil of wire with the focused seriousness of a child who had been assigned an important job and was not going to let anyone down. She pulled the roan up and climbed down. "We have a problem," she said to Caleb. "One more or the same one?" "Same one, new development." She handed him the roan's reins. "Price was at the records office this morning. He saw me, and someone cut my horse loose while I was inside." Caleb's jaw set. "He knows you're looking." "He suspects. He doesn't know what I found yet, which gives us," she calculated quickly, "perhaps 3 days before he files emergency paperwork to complete the transfer. Once it's filed and recorded, reversing it becomes exponentially harder." She looked at him directly. "I need to go to Austin." "Austin is 4 days by stage." "3 if I ride." "You're not riding to Austin alone." Meg looked at him with the specific patience she reserved for people who had said something she was going to have to address. "Mr. Weston, Caleb, I have ridden alone to places considerably less hospitable than Austin, and I have arrived without incident each time. Someone just cut your horse loose in broad daylight in a county seat," Caleb said. "That's not a warning. That's a man telling you he's willing to go further." They looked at each other across the roan's neck. Danny had gone very still beside the fence, the coil of wire in his arms, watching both of them with the particular attention he applied to situations he recognized as important. "I'll go with you," Caleb said. "You need to stay here. I told you, if you change your routine, Price will know you found someone. Then I'll get someone else to watch the ranch." He handed the reins back to her. "Clara Finch. She's 4 miles east. She's watched my stock before when I've had to travel. I'll ride over this afternoon." Meg opened her mouth. "Meg." He said her name the way he'd said it once 5 years ago, in a boarding house room in Santa Fe. Not formal, not careful, just her name. And it landed with a weight she hadn't prepared for. "Someone cut your horse loose. Let me come." The silence lasted long enough that Danny shifted the wire to one arm and looked between them with 5-year-old diplomacy. "Caleb knows the road to Austin," Danny offered. "He said so at breakfast." "You were listening at breakfast," Meg said. "I'm always listening." Danny set the wire coil down carefully against the fence post. "Mama, if somebody's trying to steal his land, more people is better." Caleb's expression did something complicated. He looked at the boy and then quickly away, and Meg recognized what she saw in his face because she had felt it herself. The specific disorientation of being correctly advised by a 5-year-old. "Fine," she said. "We leave tomorrow morning. I need today to prepare the documents I already have into a format the Austin court will accept." She looked at Caleb. "And I need you to tell me everything you know about Theodore Galt." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Galt. He drafted a water rights amendment for me 2 years ago. Price brought him in, said he specialized in water law. He's Price's attorney in Austin. He's the registered filing agent for the holding company that owns your duplicate deed." Meg reached into her satchel and pulled out her notebook, opening it to the page she'd copied the registration details onto. "They've been working together on this since before the water survey. The survey wasn't an accident, Caleb. Price commissioned it specifically to establish the value of the asset before he moved to acquire it." Caleb looked at the notebook for a long moment. She watched him absorb it. Not just the information, but the scale of it, the patience required, the months of careful maneuvering that had gone into positioning him for a theft he'd never have seen coming if Meg hadn't walked through his door. "He sat at my table," Caleb said quietly. "Drank my coffee. Told me the survey results himself. Said I was lucky having that water. He was telling himself he was lucky. He was just doing it out loud." Caleb's head came up. "I want him to answer for it, not just lose the case. I want it on the public record what he did." "That's what I intend to give you." Meg closed the notebook. "If we get to Austin before he files, we can get a preliminary injunction that freezes all property transactions on your land while the fraud investigation proceeds. That buys us time to build the full case." She paused. "It won't be quiet. Once we file for injunction, the whole county will know there's an accusation against Price." "Good," Caleb said. "Let them know." She rode to Clara Finch's property that afternoon, partly because she wanted to meet the woman Caleb trusted with his land, and partly because she needed an hour of her own company to think. The road was flat and hot, and the roan had a good steady trot that left her mind free. Clara Finch was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, and standing on her porch with a rifle in the crook of her arm when Meg came up the road. She looked at Meg for a long moment, and then called back into the house. "It's a woman!" and set the rifle against the wall and came down the steps. "You're Caleb's bookkeeper," Clara said. She had the direct manner of someone who had been alone long enough to stop bothering with preamble. "Land Records Auditor, Margaret Calloway." "I heard there was a woman and a boy out at the Weston place." Clara studied her with eyes that had been assessing strangers for decades and had gotten very good at it. "The boy's his." It was not a question. "Yes," Meg said, because there was no point being indirect with a woman who'd already arrived at the answer. Clara nodded once, the way women nodded when something they'd suspected was confirmed. "He know?" "He does now." "How's he taking it?" "Better than I expected." Meg dismounted. "Mrs. Finch, I need to ask you to watch the Weston Ranch for 3 to 4 days while Caleb and I ride to Austin. There's a legal matter that requires us both to go." "Price," Clara said. Meg looked at her. "I've been watching Harlan Price work his way through this county for 12 years, Clara said. "Took the Millison property in 78. Took the water rights on the Henderson farm the year after. Always through paperwork, always legal enough that nobody could touch him." She crossed her arms. "He finally got to Caleb's water?" "He tried." "We're going to stop him." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll watch the stock. I'll bring my nephew. He's 16, knows cattle." She looked at Meg with an expression that was not warm exactly, but was something honest and solid. "You know what you're doing? With the legal side of it?" "It's what I do. Caleb trusts you. Caleb hired me. Caleb doesn't hire people he doesn't trust. He's gone without help for 2 years rather than hire someone he wasn't sure of. Clara uncrossed her arms. The boy, Danny, he all right? The question surprised Meg. He's fine. Why? Because a child who spent his whole life without a father and then gets put in front of one without much warning. That's a lot to manage. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, but not unkind. Caleb's a good man. He's a stubborn, difficult, solitary man who hasn't let anyone close in years. But he's good underneath all that. If the boy started to like him— He has, Meg said. Then you'd better be sure about what you're building out there, because that child will forgive a lot of things, but he won't forgive being given something and then having it taken away. Meg held Clara's gaze. I'm aware of that. Good, Clara nodded again. I'll be at the ranch by sunup tomorrow. You and Caleb go do what needs doing. Meg rode back in the early evening. The light was low and golden, and the land was the particular shade of amber it turned in the last hour before dark. And she tried to think about injunction filings and secondary attorney strategies and the clean chain of evidence she needed to construct, and instead found herself thinking about what Clara had said. What you're building out there. She had not given Caleb permission to build anything. She had come here to do a job and give her son one piece of his history and leave in August with her salary and her evidence and her professional satisfaction intact. That was the arrangement. That was what she had agreed to with herself. Danny was sitting on the porch steps when she came through the gate. He had a stick and was drawing something in the dirt that had become too complicated to identify. Caleb taught me how to read a brand, Danny announced. A ranch brand. Every ranch has one, and it tells you who the animal belongs to. Did he? Ours would be 2 letters, M and D. He looked up. For Mama and Danny, if we had a ranch. Meg tied the roan to the post and said nothing. Caleb's brand is a W inside a circle, Danny continued. He said his father gave him that brand. He said brands are how you say, "This is mine," without having to say it out loud. Danny drew a circle in the dirt and put a letter inside it. I think that's important. Saying something without words. Meg sat down on the step beside him. Her boots were dusty, and her back hurt from the ride, and she was not going to make the mistake of reading meaning into a 5-year-old's conversation about cattle brands. What did you two do all day? She asked. Fixed fence, fed horses. He showed me how to test if a wire's got the right tension by plucking it like a string. Danny plucked the air with 2 fingers to demonstrate. And we talked. About what? Danny was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how honest to be. He asked me what I liked to learn. I told him numbers and maps. He said he was better with land than numbers. A pause. He said you were the best with numbers he'd ever seen. Meg looked at her son. He said it like it was a fact, Danny said, not like a compliment. Like the sky is blue. Just a true thing. He looked at his circle in the dirt. I liked that. The door behind them opened, and Caleb came out with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Meg without comment and sat on the other side of Danny on the step. And for a moment, the 3 of them sat in the last of the evening light, while the horses moved quietly in the barn and the first stars came through in the east. Clara will come tomorrow, Meg said. I know. I rode over after you left. Caleb wrapped both hands around his cup. She said you 2 talked. Briefly. She likes you. He said it with a faint note of surprise, of a man who knew Clara Finch well enough to know that was not a frequent occurrence. She doesn't like most people. I noticed. She said you were direct. I'm always direct. She meant it as a compliment. Caleb looked out at the darkening land. Price will find out we've left for Austin within a day of us going. He has people who watch the road. I know. That's why we don't take the main road. He looked at her. There are 2 routes to Austin. Price knows you'd take the faster one. We take the longer one, and we lose a day. but we arrive before anyone who's watching the fast road can send word ahead of us." She sipped her coffee. "I've already planned the route." Danny leaned slightly against Caleb's arm. The gesture was small and unconscious, the way children leaned without deciding to lean, weight shifting toward warmth without consulting the mind about it. Caleb went very still, the way he'd gone still that first day in the yard. Then, slowly, he did not move away. "We should sleep early," Meg said. "We ride at first light." "Agreed." She stood. "Danny, inside." Danny stood and looked at Caleb. "Will you tell me the capitals tomorrow? I know most of them, but I'm not sure about the western states." "I'll tell you on the road," Caleb said. "It'll give us something to do through the dull stretches." Danny nodded with satisfaction and went inside. Meg stood on the porch with her empty coffee cup and the cooling air coming in from the north and the weight of everything she was not yet ready to name pressing on the edges of what she'd decided to feel and not feel about the summer ahead. "Thank you," Caleb said, "for coming here, for not—" he stopped, "for giving me the chance to know him." Meg looked at the darkening sky. "He's extraordinary," she said. "He was extraordinary before you knew he existed. I want you to understand that." "I know." "I built that, on my own, with nothing." "I know that too." His voice was quiet and carried no argument. "I'm not going to take any credit I didn't earn, Meg. I just want the chance to earn some going forward." She looked at him then. He was looking back at her, with an expression that was not asking for anything, which was the only reason she was able to look at it directly. "Don't make promises," she said. "Actions." "Actions," he agreed. She went inside. She did not look back. But she heard him stay on the porch for a long time after, in the dark, on land that someone was trying to steal from him, sitting with the weight of 5 years of absence and whatever he intended to do about it. And she thought, getting her notebook out and beginning to organize her evidence for Austin, that the most important thing she had learned in 8 years of records work was this: the truth always left a trace. Always. No matter how carefully someone tried to bury it. She was going to find every last trace of Harlan Price's deception, and she was going to lay it out in a courtroom in Austin, so clean and so complete that there would be nowhere left to hide. And then, what happened after that, she would figure out when she got there. They rode out before Clara Finch arrived, leaving a note on the kitchen table with instructions detailed enough that Meg had written them in 2 columns. Ranch operations on the left, Danny's schedule on the right. She had spent 20 minutes on that note the night before, and had not let herself examine why the Danny column had taken longer to write than the ranch column. Danny had not cried when she said goodbye. He had stood on the porch in the gray pre-dawn, with his arms crossed the way he crossed them when he was working very hard not to show what he was feeling, which was a habit he had gotten from her, and she was not proud of it. "How long?" he'd asked. 4 days, maybe 5. "Clara's nice." He'd said it as a question disguised as a statement. "She's direct and capable, and she'll make sure you eat properly." Meg had crouched down to his level. "Danny, look at me." He'd looked at her. "I will come back. That is a fact, not a promise. There is a difference." He'd nodded once. Then he'd turned to Caleb, who was leading the horses out of the barn, and said, "You'll come back too?" Caleb had stopped walking. He'd looked at the boy in the early gray light, and something had moved across his face. Something Meg had seen, but not been able to name. Some rearrangement of the man's interior that was too new and too significant for her to catalog correctly at 4 in the morning. "Yeah," Caleb had said. "I'll come back." Danny had nodded again, satisfied, and gone inside to wait for Clara. They rode the long route south before cutting east, adding 4 hours to the journey, but staying off the main road that Price's people would be watching. Caleb knew the alternate terrain well enough to navigate without landmarks, which told Meg he had ridden it before under circumstances he hadn't explained and she hadn't asked about. She was filing that away. They didn't talk for the first hour. The land was still cool from the night, and the horses were fresh, and there was enough to think about that silence was more productive than conversation. Caleb broke it first. "What do you need when we get to Austin?" Theodore Galt's original incorporation filings for the Brazos Trust. The court records office will have them. Incorporation documents are public record, which is Price's second mistake. He used his own notary on both the duplicate deed and the Brazos paperwork. Different counties, so he thought no one would compare them. Meg kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I need an affidavit from the county records clerk in Cutter's Creek, confirming the dates the original deed and the duplicate were filed. I need that before I can appear before the Austin court." "You think the clerk will sign it? He works in Price's county." "He's a records clerk, not Price's employee. His obligation is to the accuracy of the public record. And I made sure he understood that yesterday morning." She paused. "I was very pleasant about it." "I expect you were." She glanced at him. He was watching the road with a look that might, on a less contained man, have been the beginning of a smile. "The injunction is the first step," she continued. "Once we freeze the property transfer, Price can't complete the sale to the Brazos Trust. That gives us time to build the criminal fraud case, which is separate from the civil property case and requires a higher standard of evidence." "How much higher?" "Considerably. Civil court, I need to show the duplicate deed is fraudulent beyond reasonable probability. Criminal court, I need to show Price created it with deliberate intent to defraud." She looked at him directly. "That's where Galt becomes critical. If I can demonstrate that Price and Galt coordinated the filing strategy across 2 counties, that establishes the conspiracy element. Conspiracy to defraud is a felony in Texas." Caleb absorbed this without speaking for a moment. "You've done this before. Criminal fraud cases." "3 times. I won 2 of them." "What happened to the third?" "The defendant destroyed the original documents before I could subpoena them. Without the physical evidence, the chain of proof broke." She kept her voice level. "That won't happen here. Price filed through the county system, which means copies exist in 3 separate offices. He can't destroy all of them without committing additional crimes that would themselves be evidence." "He thought he was being careful," Caleb said. "He was being careful. He just didn't know I was coming." This time, she was certain it was a smile, brief and real, gone before it fully arrived. They stopped at midday at a creek crossing to water the horses and eat the food Clara had left on the kitchen counter before they'd departed. Cornbread and hard cheese and 2 apples that Danny had added to the bag without being asked, which Meg had discovered and said nothing about. She ate standing, her notebook open, reviewing the sequence of filings she'd copied from the records office. Caleb sat on a rock near the water and watched her work. "You always eat standing up?" he asked. "When I'm thinking. What happens if you sit down while you're thinking?" "The thinking stops." She turned a page. "I don't know why. It just does. Danny sits down to think, sits very still." Meg looked up. "Yesterday, while you were gone," Caleb said. He was looking at the creek, not at her. "He sat at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes without moving. I thought something was wrong. Asked him if he was all right. He said he was counting. He counts things that bother him," Meg said. "It organizes them. What was he counting? You'd have to ask him." She paused. "What did you say when he told you?" "I said that sounded useful." He said it was. Caleb picked up a flat stone and turned it in his hands. Then he asked me if I thought numbers were more honest than words, because they didn't have extra meanings. Meg was quiet. I said I thought that depended on who was using them, Caleb continued. He thought about it and said I was probably right. He set the stone down. He's extraordinary, Meg. I know. Her voice came out shorter than she intended. Not because the words were wrong, because they were precisely right, and she hadn't been prepared for them. I'm not saying it to earn something, Caleb said. He looked at her then. I'm saying it because he is, and you made him that, and you should hear it said by someone who isn't obligated. Meg closed her notebook. She looked at the creek and counted the seconds, the way Danny counted things that bothered her, and got to 6 before she trusted her voice again. We should keep moving, she said. We need to reach the overnight stop before dark. Caleb stood without argument. He had a quality she had forgotten and was now being reminded of with increasing inconvenience. The quality of knowing when not to push. It was a rarer thing in a man than it should have been. They reached the small way-station town of Breckett by late afternoon. A hotel of sorts, 4 rooms above a saloon, the kind of place that existed specifically for travelers who had misjudged their distances. Meg took a room. Caleb took the one beside it without discussion. She was at the small desk in her room working through her evidence outline when she heard voices downstairs. Raised voices. She identified Caleb's, or rather, she identified the particular quality of silence that Caleb's voice created in a room when he was not pleased, which was a silence she hadn't known she remembered until she heard it again. She went downstairs. There were 3 men at the bar she hadn't seen when they'd arrived. Trailhands by their clothes, or men dressed like trailhands, which was not the same thing. The one closest to Caleb was saying something in a low, deliberate tone that stopped when Meg came down the stairs. Caleb had not moved. He stood with his shoulders level and his hands at his sides, and the particular stillness of a man who had already calculated every way this could go and was waiting to see which one the other man chose. Problem? Meg said from the bottom step. All 3 men looked at her. The one closest to Caleb had the flat eyes of someone who'd been paid to deliver a message rather than start a fight, which meant someone had known they'd be here, which meant the long route had been watched too. No problem, ma'am, the man said. Just having a conversation. With Mr. Weston. That's right. About what? A pause. The man looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Meg with an expression that said, I have this managed, and also, underneath it, I'm glad you came down. Somebody wanted to pass on some information, Caleb said. His voice was even. About the advisability of continuing to Austin. Did they? Meg stepped off the last stair. She walked to the bar and stood beside Caleb and looked at the 3 men with the same expression she used in courthouse hallways when someone tried to tell her a filing was unavailable. And what specific information was that? The man closest shifted his weight. He'd expected, she could see, either to frighten Caleb into turning back or to deliver his message to a man alone. He had not expected to be questioned by a woman in a dusty traveling dress who looked at him like he was a misfiled document. That Austin's a long way, the man said finally, and roads in this part of Texas can be unpredictable. Roads, Meg said. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Price sent you. She said it as a statement of fact, not a question, in the same tone she'd used to read an entry from a ledger, and she watched the man's eyes do the thing eyes did when someone named a truth they hadn't intended to confirm. I don't know any... You were at the records office yesterday morning, Meg said. You were one of the 2 men leaning against the building when I came out. I noticed you because you were trying not to look at me, which in my experience means someone has told you specifically to watch for me. She tilted her head. Tell Mr. Price that the documents I'm carrying are copies. The originals are already filed in 3 separate locations. Threatening me on the road to Austin doesn't stop what's coming. It just adds to it. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He just looked back. The man picked up his glass, finished his drink, and set it down. "Have a safe ride," he said, and the three of them left. The saloon went back to its ordinary noise. Meg turned to the barman and asked for coffee, and took it to a table in the corner and sat down, and let the steadiness she'd maintained for the last 4 minutes dissolve privately into the specific shakiness that always came after, when the confrontation was over and the body finally admitted it had been frightened. Caleb sat across from her. "You shouldn't have come down," he said. "You're welcome." "I had it managed." 3 men to 1 isn't managed, it's optimistic. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "And they weren't there to fight. They were there to frighten. Frightening doesn't work as well when there are 2 people, and one of them seems unconcerned." "You seemed unconcerned." "That's different from being unconcerned." Caleb studied her face. "Your hands are shaking." "Yes." She didn't move them. "That happens after, not during. It's just adrenaline. It means nothing." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He knows about the documents. He knows we're going to Austin. The long route bought us 1 day, not 2. "I know. Which means we need to be in that courthouse first thing tomorrow morning. File before he can get an emergency counterfiling in." "I know that too." She took a breath. "We'll ride out at 4. We can make Austin by 9 if we push. The horses can manage it. Then we manage it." They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the saloon continued its evening business, indifferent to the specific disaster they were trying to prevent. And Meg thought about Price in his well-appointed office in Cutter's Creek, calculating, adjusting, sending men down roads. He was smart. She had understood that from the documents. But he was smart in the way people were smart when they had never been seriously opposed, confident in his own complexity, dismissive of opposition he hadn't anticipated. He had anticipated Caleb. He had not anticipated Meg. That was, she thought, his 3rd mistake. "I need to ask you something," Caleb said. She looked up. "When this is over, when we've got the injunction and the fraud case is filed, and Price is answering to a judge." He paused, picked his words with the care of a man who had been thinking about them for a while. "What were you planning to do?" "Leave," Meg said. "Go back to Santa Fe. I have other clients, other cases." "Take Dammy." "Of course take Dammy. He's my son." "He's mine, too." The words were quiet and held no accusation, only the plain statement of something Caleb had clearly decided was true enough to say out loud. "I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not going to make claims I haven't earned the right to make. But I'd like to talk about what happens after. Not in terms of legal arrangements or formal agreements, just—" He looked at her directly. "I'd like Danny to know where I am. I'd like to know where he is. If that's something you'd consider." Meg held his gaze. "That's a significant change from a man who left a note that said Amarillo." "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." The simplicity of that answer was harder to dismiss than an argument would have been. She had built a considerable architecture of distance in the last 5 years, constructed it carefully around herself and Danny, and it had served them. It had kept things manageable. But she was beginning to see the edges of it more clearly than she had before. The way it kept out the cold, and also the warmth. The way it had worked fine until a 5-year-old started sitting very still at kitchen tables, counting things that bothered him. "Let's get through Austin first," she said. "Fair enough." "And Caleb," she met his eyes. "What those men said tonight. The road being unpredictable. Price is escalating because he's afraid of losing, and afraid men make decisions that careful men don't. I need you to understand that when we walk into that courthouse tomorrow, the danger doesn't end. It increases. I understand. I'm not asking if you're willing to take the risk. I'm telling you what the risk is. There's a difference. I've been taking risks with this land for 4 years, Caleb said. Didn't know what I was up against, because I didn't know anyone was coming at me. Now I know, and I've got someone who knows how to fight it the right way. His eyes stayed on hers. That's not a smaller risk, but it's a better one. Meg finished her coffee. She put the cup down and looked at the table, and thought about 300 miles, and a note that said Amarillo, and a boy who counted things that bothered him at kitchen tables on strangers' ranches. I need to review my filing strategy before we sleep, she said. I want to be ready for every counter-argument Price's Austin attorney might raise. I'll let you work. You should sleep. 4 o'clock comes fast. He stood. Meg. He said it the way he'd said it the night before. Not formal, not tentative, just her name. Accurate and deliberate. Thank you for coming to Texas, for all of it. She looked up at him. He was standing in a saloon in Breckett, Texas, with trail dust on his coat, and the particular expression of a man who had spent years being sufficient unto himself, and was finding that sufficient was no longer enough. And she thought with considerable irritation that he had absolutely no right to look like that. Go to sleep, she said. We have a thief to catch. He went. She got out her notebook and spread the papers across the table, and began constructing the argument she would make tomorrow in an Austin courthouse to the most senior judge she could get in front of on short notice. And she thought about what it meant that Price had sent men to stop her, which was the most honest compliment her work had ever received. She also thought, briefly, and against her considerable better judgment, about what Caleb had said about Danny. He's extraordinary, Meg. Said like a fact. Said like the sky is blue. She put her pen to paper and wrote the opening line of her injunction request, and did not think about it again. There was too much to do, and too little time, and the truth wasn't going to make it into that courtroom by itself. She was going to have to carry it there, and she had never once dropped what she carried. She did not intend to start tomorrow. They rode into Austin at 8:47 in the morning. Meg knew the time because she had been checking it against the courthouse opening hour since they'd crossed the city limits, calculating the margin, running the numbers the way she ran everything. Precisely, without sentiment, because precision was the only thing that worked when everything else was uncertain. The Travis County Courthouse was a 3-story stone building on Congress Avenue that smelled like every courthouse Meg had ever worked in. Old paper and floor wax, and the particular staleness of rooms where consequential things happened too slowly. She had been in better courthouses, and worse ones. She did not care about the building. She cared about what was inside it. Stay close, she said to Caleb as they tied the horses. Don't speak unless someone asks you a direct question. If Price has already filed something, let me read it completely before you react to it. Whatever it says. Understood. I mean that. Whatever it says. He looked at her. What do you think it says? I think it says something designed to make you angry enough to say something that damages our position. She picked up her satchel. So don't. The clerk at the filing desk was a middle-aged woman with the efficient manner of someone who had processed 10,000 emergencies and ranked them all accordingly. Meg set her documents on the counter and introduced herself with her full credentials and the name of the Cutters Creek records clerk who had signed her supporting affidavit at 6 in the morning when she'd stopped to collect it on the way through. I need to file for an emergency injunction on a property transfer, Meg said. Weston Ranch, registered in Breckett County, Western Quarter. The transfer is fraudulent. I have the documentation. The clerk looked at the stack. This is substantial. Yes. Has the transfer already been filed for completion? Meg's hands went still on the counter. Has there been a filing on that property in the last 48 hours? The clerk checked her records. The seconds that passed were the longest Meg had experienced since Danny's first fever at 8 months old, when she'd sat in a rented room alone, watching his chest rise and fall and counting the intervals. "Yes," the clerk said. "Completion filing came in yesterday afternoon. Brazos Land and Water Trust, acquiring the western quarter of the Weston property. Filed by a Theodore Galt on behalf of the transferring party." Caleb said nothing. Meg felt him go still beside her, the way he'd gone still in the saloon in Beckett. That particular controlled stillness, and she put her hand briefly on his arm without looking at him. "Then I need to file the injunction to freeze that completion," she said to the clerk. Her voice came out exactly as she needed it to. "And I need to do it in the next 10 minutes before the filing office processes Galt's submission." "Is Judge Hargrove on the bench today?" "Judge Hargrove is in session." "Then I need 5 minutes with him on an emergency basis. I have standing." She laid her territorial certification on the counter. "And I have evidence of deliberate fraud that this court will want to see before it processes that completion filing." The clerk looked at the certification, looked at Meg, looked at the stack of documents. Then she stood up and said, "Wait here," and went through the door behind her. Caleb spoke quietly beside Meg. "He filed yesterday, while we were on the road." "I know. Price sent those men to slow us down, bought himself 1 extra day to complete it." "Yes. Can you still stop it?" Meg looked at the door the clerk had gone through. "The completion filing takes 72 hours to process in Travis County. I know because I checked the county procedural rules before we left Cutter's Creek." She kept her voice low and even. "It's been 18 hours since Galt filed. We have 54 hours to get an injunction in front of a judge, which means we need to be in that courtroom today." She paused. "Which is why I need Judge Hargrove." "Do you know him?" "I know of him. He presided over the Meridian water rights case in 1879. He ruled against the party that had filed fraudulent easement documentation." She met Caleb's eyes. "He does not like people who lie to his court." The door opened. The clerk came back. "Judge Hargrove will see you. You have 15 minutes before his morning session resumes." Judge Hargrove was 70 years old, sharp-eyed, and visibly displeased at being interrupted before 10 in the morning. He sat behind a desk that was larger than the one Meg used for working and smaller than the one she'd seen in the Cutter's Creek attorney's office, which she took as a good sign. Men with oversized furniture were compensating for something. "Miss Calloway," the judge said, "you have 15 minutes, and I have read longer briefs than yours in less. Make it worth my time." Meg opened her satchel and placed the documents on his desk in the order she had arranged them the night before in the Beckett saloon, working by lamplight while Caleb slept. She had constructed the sequence the way she constructed every case, not from the most dramatic evidence first, but from the foundation up, each document building on the last, so that by the time the judge reached the conclusion, he had arrived at it himself through the evidence, rather than being asked to accept her interpretation of it. "The original deed," she said, "filed 1878 when Mr. Weston purchased the property. Note the ink color, the paper weight, the notary stamp impression depth, consistent with 4-year-old documentation processed in the ordinary course of business." Hargrove looked. "The duplicate deed," Meg said, "filed 8 months ago through Theodore Galt's office in this county, purporting to transfer the western quarter to the Brazos Land and Water Trust." Note the ink color. Close match, but not identical. The oxidation rate is inconsistent with documentation supposedly 4 years old. Note the paper. Artificially aged, achievable with a combination of heat and diluted acid, detectable to anyone with experience in historical documents. And note the notary stamp impression. Pressed too deep, by someone applying more force than a routine stamping requires. Pressed by someone who was nervous. Hargrove set the two documents side by side. The Brazos Land and Water Trust Incorporation filing, Meg continued. Registered in Austin 14 months ago. The registered agent is Theodore Galt. The notary stamp on this document is identical. Same stamp, same registration number as the notary stamp on the duplicate deed. Both documents notarized by Harlan Price of Cutters Creek, Breckett County, across two different county filings in two different jurisdictions. She placed her final document on top, an affidavit from the Breckett County Records Clerk confirming the sequential filing dates and confirming that both deeds, the original and the duplicate, were found in the same property file. Hargrove looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Meg waited. She had learned the most important thing about judges 20 years before she'd ever set foot in a courthouse. Learned it from her mother, who had said, "Let people think. Silence is not a problem to be solved. It is a process completing itself." "Mr. Weston," Hargrove said without looking up, "this is your property." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "Did you authorize any transfer of the Western Quarter?" "No, sir." "Did you engage Theodore Galt in any transaction related to your property?" "Price brought him in 2 years ago for a water rights amendment. I thought he was doing standard legal work. I didn't know about any of this until Miss Calloway found it." Hargrove looked at Meg. "You're certain of the document analysis?" "I have 8 years of experience with fraudulent land documentation," Meg said. "I have testified as an expert witness in 3 fraud cases in territorial court. I can provide references from 2 presiding judges if you require them." Hargrove looked back at the documents. "The completion filing came through this office yesterday." "Yes, Your Honor, which means you have 53 hours before it processes. I'm asking for an emergency injunction to freeze the completion pending full fraud investigation." She kept her voice steady. "If the completion processes, reversing it becomes a 2-year legal proceeding. If we freeze it now, the criminal fraud case can be built from a position of stability rather than pursuit." "You're asking me to act on evidence gathered by a non-attorney." "I'm asking you to act on documented physical evidence that any expert in the field will confirm, gathered by a certified territorial records auditor with standing granted by the property owner." Meg put both hands flat on the desk. "Your Honor, Harlan Price has been practicing law in Breckett County for 12 years. He has the confidence of someone who has done this before and not been caught. I have found evidence of at least 2 prior property manipulations in that county that I believe bear investigation. He did this to your court. He filed fraudulent documentation with Travis County, and he sent men to slow down the people who were coming to report it." She paused. "I am asking you to not let him succeed." The room was very quiet. Hargrove picked up the 2 deeds and held them side by side against the light from the window. "The stamp impression," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." He set them down. "The injunction is granted. I'll have it on file within the hour. Galt's completion will be frozen pending investigation." He looked at Meg over the documents. "I want a full evidentiary brief on my desk by Friday. Complete chain of documentation, your full analysis, and every instance of prior manipulation you've identified." "You'll have it Thursday," Meg said. The judge looked at her for a moment, with the expression that senior judges sometimes got when they encountered work they recognized as better than what they usually saw. He didn't say anything further. He picked up his pen and began writing. Meg gathered her documents and walked out. In the corridor outside the judge's office, Caleb stopped walking. Meg took 3 more steps before she realized he wasn't beside her and turned around. He was standing in the middle of the corridor, with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she had no prepared response to. Something between relief and something older and more complicated. The look of a man who had just watched something he couldn't do himself be done perfectly by someone else, and was working out how he felt about needing that. "It worked," he said. "It worked so far. We still have to build the criminal case. You walked in there with paper and walked out with my land. I walked in there with evidence and walked out with a freeze on a fraudulent filing. The land was always yours." She looked at him steadily. "This is what I do, Caleb. This is what I'm good at." "I know." He said it the way he said things he meant without decoration. "I know that. I'm not—" He stopped. "I've been handling trouble on my own for a long time. Didn't think I needed—" Another stop. "Thank you feels like the wrong size word for this."
"It's the right size word," Meg said. "It'll do." He put his hat back on, and she turned, and they walked out of the courthouse into the Austin morning. And Meg did not let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened until they were outside, and she had 3 feet of open air around her. Then she let herself feel it. Not triumph, because she had learned early that triumph was premature until the criminal case was closed, but something quieter. The satisfaction of a thing done correctly, precisely, completely, with every piece of evidence in its right place. She had not dropped what she carried. The counter-response came 2 hours later. They were at a telegraph office on Congress Avenue, Meg drafting the wire to the Cutters Creek records clerk to confirm the injunction had been granted, when a man in a suit that cost more than Caleb's monthly operating expenses came through the door and said, "Miss Calloway, my name is Bernard Alcott. I represent Harlan Price." Meg did not look up from the telegraph form. "Mr. Alcott." Mr. Price moved quickly. "My client disputes the characterization of the Brazos filing as fraudulent and intends to challenge the injunction on grounds that the evidence presented was gathered without proper judicial authorization. The property owner authorized the records audit." Meg set down her pen and looked at Alcott directly. "Which is all the authorization required under Texas property law for an owner-initiated fraud investigation. If Mr. Price's attorneys weren't aware of that provision, I'd suggest they review Chapter 47 of the revised territorial statutes." She tilted her head. "Was there something else?" Alcott looked at Caleb, then back at Meg. He had the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting a particular kind of opposition and found a different kind entirely. "My client is prepared to offer a settlement, a payment to Mr. Weston for the assessed value of the Western Quarter, plus a premium of 30%, in exchange for a full release of all fraud allegations and withdrawal of the injunction request." The telegraph office had gone quiet. The clerk behind the counter was making a concentrated effort to appear absent. Caleb said, very quietly, "No." "Mr. Weston, no," Caleb said again. The word was the same size both times. Not louder, but the second one had more weight to it. "That water belongs to this county, to every rancher in 50 miles who'll need it in a drought year. Price wanted to own it and sell access back to the people it belonged to all along." He looked at Alcott with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely immovable. "The answer is no. It will keep being no." Alcott looked at Meg. "You heard him," Meg said. "I'd also note for your records that this settlement offer, made after an injunction has been filed, will be included in my evidentiary brief to Judge Hargrove as evidence of consciousness of guilt on your client's part. People who haven't done anything wrong don't generally offer 30% premiums to make accusations go away." Alcott left. Caleb sat down in one of the telegraph office chairs, which was not built for a man his size,
and said nothing for a moment. "He was testing how much we'd take to go away," Meg said. "I know what he was doing. The offer means Price is genuinely afraid. A man who is confident in his legal position doesn't offer 30% over market value. He fights." She picked up her pen again. "This is good news." "Doesn't feel like good news." "It will." She looked at him. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose, and he had the look of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just understood how heavy it actually was. "Caleb, the land is safe. The water is safe. Price is going to face a judge, and he's going to face him with evidence he can't explain away." "That's not what I'm thinking about." She waited. "I'm thinking about Danny," he said. "Sitting at Clara's ranch, waiting for us to come back. Thinking about the Western Quarter and that water that nearly got taken, and what that would have meant for the ranch. What it would have meant for—" He stopped. "For whether there was anything worth coming back to." Meg set the pen down. "I built that place to last," Caleb said. "After everything. After my father's land, after years of working ground that belonged to other men. I built it to be something permanent. Something that would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after that." He looked at his hands. "I didn't know, 5 years ago, that I was building it for more than myself. I didn't know there was a boy who might someday—" He stopped again. "Caleb?" He looked up. "When we get back," Meg said carefully, "Danny is going to ask you 100 questions about the courthouse and the horses and every state capital on the route and whatever else he's thought of in the time we've been gone. And then, in the middle of all that, at some point when you're not expecting it, he's going to say something absolutely precise and true about something that matters, the way he does. And you're going to have to be ready for that." "Ready how?" "Ready to answer honestly. He doesn't have a system for dishonesty. He didn't develop one because I never used it with him." She held Caleb's gaze. "Whatever you tell him, it has to be true. Even the parts that are uncertain, especially those." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And what do I tell him about you?" Meg picked her pen back up. "That's not your question to answer." "Whose is it?" "Mine," she said, "when I'm ready to answer it." She finished the telegraph wire and handed it to the clerk, and paid for it, and walked out into the Austin afternoon with Caleb beside her, and the injunction filed, and the settlement refused, and 53 hours of work still ahead of her before the criminal brief was ready, and only the particular, inconvenient knowledge that the most complicated thing she was dealing with had nothing to do with Harlan Price, or forged deeds, or fraudulent notary stamps. It had to do with a man walking beside her who said thank you like it meant something, and listened like the person speaking was the only thing in his field of vision. And a 5-year-old boy, 4 hours north, who was counting things at a kitchen table and waiting for people who had promised to come back. She was going to finish the work. She was going to put Harlan Price in front of a judge with evidence so clean it could not be argued with. She was going to ride back to that ranch and collect her son, and she was going to think very clearly and honestly about the question Caleb had asked her. She just needed a few more days to be certain she was ready to answer it truthfully. And Margaret Calloway, whatever else she was, had always told the truth. Even the hard ones. Especially those. The evidentiary brief took 2 days and 1 full night. Meg worked at the desk in her Austin hotel room with the lamp turned high and the window open to let in whatever air the July night was willing to offer, which was not much. She wrote in the precise, economical language she had developed over 8 years of making complex fraud legible to people who had not spent their careers studying it. Every sentence earning its place, every claim supported by the document it referenced, every document referenced by its filing date, location, and chain of custody. Caleb brought her food she mostly forgot to eat. He sat in the chair by the window and read the newspaper and did not ask how it was going, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she noticed it. On the second morning, she handed him the completed brief across the breakfast table. "Read it," she said. "All of it. You're the property owner. You need to understand every piece of this before it goes to Hargrove." He read it while she drank coffee and looked out the window at Congress Avenue and thought about Danny, who had now been at Clara Finch's ranch for 4 days and had almost certainly reorganized something. "This is everything," Caleb said when he finished. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something you understood the weight of. Every transaction, every filing, the full pattern going back 18 months. 12 years, Meg said. "I found 2 prior cases going back to 1870. Different property owners, different counties, same method. Price has been doing this his entire career. The Weston Ranch was the largest target he'd attempted because the water asset was the largest he'd found." Caleb looked at her. "You found 12 years of it in 2 days." "I found the pattern in 2 days. The pattern was always there. Nobody looked." She picked up the brief. "I'm going to Hargrove's office. I'll be an hour." "I'm coming." "You don't need to." "I know." He stood and picked up his hat. "I'm coming anyway." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her satchel and walked out. And he fell into step beside her. And she did not tell him again to stay behind, because she had told him once, and he had heard her, and chosen differently. And she had, she was discovering, a certain respect for a man who knew when to hold his position. Judge Hargrove received them without ceremony. He read the brief at his desk while they sat across from him in silence, Meg tracking his eyes to see which sections he slowed on, which he read twice, which he moved through quickly, because the argument was clear enough to need only one pass. When he finished, he looked up and said, "This is sufficient for criminal referral." "Yes, Your Honor." "I'm referring the matter to the state prosecutor's office today. Galt as well as Price." He set the brief on his desk with the deliberateness of a man putting something into its permanent place. "The injunction stands. The completion filing for the Brazos transfer is voided. Mr. Weston's title to the Western Quarter is restored to clear status pending prosecution." He looked at Caleb. "Your land is whole, Mr. Weston." Caleb nodded once. His jaw was set, and his hands were still, and he said, "Thank you, Your Honor," in a voice that was steady and meant it. Hargrove looked at Meg. "Miss Calloway, I've been on this bench for 19 years. I have seen a great deal of document fraud in that time." He paused. "I have rarely seen it dismantled this completely or this fast." "The evidence was there," Meg said. "It always is. Someone just had to look." "Someone did," Hargrove said. "See that you keep looking." They walked out of the Travis County Courthouse for the second time into air that was already thick with morning heat. And this time, Caleb didn't stop in the corridor. He walked all the way out to the front steps, and then he stood there with his hat in his hands and his head tilted back and his eyes closed for a moment. And Meg stood beside him and let him have it. "It's done," she said. "Yeah," he opened his eyes. "It's done. The prosecution will take time, months, maybe more, but the land is settled. That part is finished." He looked at her. "You did that. We did it. You owned the land. You refused the settlement when refusing was the harder choice." She met his eyes directly. "Don't give me all of it. That's not accurate, and I don't accept things that aren't accurate." The edge of his mouth moved. "You don't accept a lot of things." "I accept exactly what I can verify." She looked away down Congress Avenue. We should ride back today. Danny's been patient, but he has limits. He gets that from you. He gets the counting from me. The patience is something else entirely. She started down the steps. I'll get the horses. They rode north out of Austin in the mid-morning, and the land opened up around them the way Texas land opened up. Suddenly, completely, without apology. The sky going wide and the ground going flat, and the heat lying over everything like something decided. Meg let the roan find her pace and didn't push her. They had been riding for an hour when Caleb said, I need to ask you something. You said that in Beckett. Different question this time. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I asked you before what happens after. You said, let's get through Austin first. I remember. We're through Austin. Meg looked at the road. The roan's ears moved forward and back, tracking sound, measuring the world the way animals measured everything, by what was immediate and real. Yes, she said. We are. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, Caleb said. I'm not asking you to decide anything this week. What I'm asking is whether there's a decision to be made. Whether that's even something you're... He paused. I don't know how to ask this without it sounding like I'm making assumptions. Then ask it plainly, and I'll tell you if the assumption is wrong. He looked at her. Is there something here, between us, that's that you'd be willing to... He stopped. I'm doing this badly. You're doing it honestly, Meg said, which is not the same as badly. She rode in silence for a moment. The roan's hooves were steady on the packed earth, and the sun was climbing, and she thought about 300 miles and a placement paper with a name on it, and 2 days in a hotel room building a case that had nothing and everything to do with why she'd come. When I signed the placement papers, she said, I told myself it was practical. The salary, the work, the proximity to county records I needed for a separate case I was developing. She kept her voice even. I am very good at telling myself things are practical. I know, Caleb said. I came because Danny asked me why he didn't have a father, and I ran out of ways to answer that didn't feel like lies. She looked at the road. And I came because I thought about you sometimes. Not often. Not in ways I examined closely. But sometimes. The silence that followed was the kind that needed to exist for a moment, before anything else could. I'm not the same man I was in Santa Fe, Caleb said. No, you're not. She looked at him. You're more difficult in some ways. You're more certain of yourself. You take up more room in a conversation without saying more words, which is a specific quality I have no adequate explanation for. She paused. You're also better, more careful, more willing to hear things you'd rather not. You made me hear things I'd rather not. That's my professional training. No, he said. It's not. She looked away. Danny needs to be at the center of whatever this is, not around the edges of it. Not managed around the edges of an arrangement between two adults. He's been at the center of my life for 5 years, and that doesn't move. I don't want it to move, Caleb said. I want to be in the same place he is. Both of you. He said it with the directness of a man who had decided what was true and was done finding careful ways to say it. I want to learn him properly. Every way he counts things and organizes things and asks questions that are 4 questions in one. I want to be the person who gets to watch him figure out who he's going to be. He paused. And I want you. Not because of Danny. Alongside Danny. Those are separate things, and I need you to know I understand they're separate. Meg looked at him for a long moment. The land went past around them, and the heat lay over everything, and she thought about what Clara Finch had said on her porch. What you're building out there, said by a woman, who had watched people build things for 60 years and knew the difference between something temporary and something that would last. "I am not easy to be with," Meg said. "I need things to be accurate. I correct errors in real time, and I find it very difficult to stop doing that. I work constantly, and I think in parallel, and I will always, always choose Danny first." "I know all of that." "You've known me for 8 days." "I've known you for 5 years," Caleb said. "I just didn't know where you were for most of them." She turned that over. It was accurate, she decided. Irritatingly, precisely accurate, in the way that the most honest things were. "I need time," she said. "You have it." "I mean genuine time, not time as a formality before a decision I've already made."
"I need to watch you with Danny over weeks, not days. I need to see who you are when things are ordinary, rather than in crisis." She met his eyes. "Crisis shows you what people are capable of. Ordinary life shows you who they actually are."
"That's fair," Caleb said.
"I'm staying through August," she said. "The original agreement."
"All right."
"And when August ends, we talk. About what we've learned, about what Danny needs, about what's actually possible." She looked at the road ahead. "That's what I can offer right now."
"That's enough," Caleb said. "That's more than enough."
They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was different from the silences before it. Not the silence of two people being careful around each other, but the silence of two people who had said the necessary things and could now simply move through the same space without the weight of the unsaid pressing on everything. Danny was sitting on Clara Finch's porch when they came up the road. He was off the step and running before they'd fully stopped, covering the distance between them in the loose-limbed sprint of a child who has been patient for 4 days and is completely done being patient. He reached Caleb's horse first, which Meg noticed and did not make herself feel anything specific about. And Caleb swung down and caught him and lifted him up in one motion that looked like it had been done 100 times rather than twice. "You came back," Danny said. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact being confirmed. The way Danny confirmed facts, out loud, precisely, with relief underneath the precision. "Said I would," Caleb said. "I know. I was still checking." Meg dismounted, and Danny transferred immediately to her, wrapping both arms around her neck with the completeness that children wrapped with when they had been missing someone and were not going to be indirect about it. She held him for a moment longer than she usually let herself.
"Were you all right?" she asked. "Clara taught me to make biscuits."
He pulled back to look at her face.
"I made 12. Caleb, I made 12 biscuits, and none of them were flat."
"I expect they were the best biscuits in the county," Caleb said.
"They were good," Danny said, with the honesty of someone who had calibrated assessment of his own work. "Not the best. Clara's were better, but she's had more practice." Clara Finch came off the porch, with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who had spent 4 days with a 5-year-old and had emerged with her opinions confirmed rather than changed. She looked at Meg. "He reorganized my pantry." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's better now." He put everything in order of how often it gets used and labeled the shelves in a hand that's neater than mine. Clara looked at the boy still being held by his mother. "He told me about the courthouse. He wanted to know every procedural step of how a fraud case gets filed." "He would.
I only knew half of it."
Clara looked at Meg with the directness Meg had come to recognize as her version of warmth. "You got it done?" "It's done." Clara nodded once. Then she looked at Caleb. "And you kept your head." "Meg kept mine when I couldn't," Caleb said. "Good." Clara looked between them with the assessment of 60 years of watching people and knowing what she was looking at. "You two want supper before you ride back?"
or after? After, Meg said. Danny's been away from the horses long enough. Danny's head came up immediately. Magistrate? She's waiting, Caleb said. The ride back to the Weston Ranch took less than an hour, and Danny spent it asking questions about the Austin courthouse and the judge and the names of the streets they'd ridden through, and whether Texas had more courthouses than other states, and what exactly a notary stamp was, and why pressing it too hard mattered. Meg answered everything in full, because that was what Danny required and what he deserved, and she heard Caleb adding details from his side. Small observations, the smell of the courthouse, the clerk's ink-stained fingers, the weight of the brief when Hargrove set it down. Things that weren't procedural, but were true. And she heard Danny absorbing them the way he absorbed everything, completely, with the permanent quality of someone who kept what they took in. The ranch came into view around the bend in the familiar way it came into view, and Meg had the unexpected and inconvenient experience of recognizing it as familiar. 8 days. She had been here 8 days, and the sight of that porch and that fence line and the barn door standing open in the July heat felt, against all reasonable argument, like coming back to something she recognized. She was going to examine that very carefully, later, accurately, without letting it mean more than it did, or possibly more. Danny went straight to the barn. They heard him greeting Magistrate with the particular tone he reserved for animals he had decided were his specific responsibility. Low and serious, and full of the kind of sincere attention that horses and 5-year-olds both required and rarely received from adults. Meg stood at the fence while Caleb took the horses, and she listened to Danny talk to the gray mare and thought about August and what August meant, and whether she was the kind of woman who could let a thing become what it was becoming without managing it into something smaller and safer. She thought about her mother, who had been practical and precise, and had built a good life on those qualities, and had also cried once at the kitchen table when Meg was 7 and said, "I am so tired of being capable all by myself." She had not cried long. She had made tea and gotten back to work, and never said it again. Meg had been 7. She had never forgotten it. Caleb came to stand beside her at the fence. He didn't say anything. They stood in the late afternoon heat, with the sound of Danny and the horses coming from the barn, and the land going flat and golden in every direction, and the particular quality of a summer evening in Texas that made everything feel both temporary and permanent at once. "He said something to me yesterday morning," Caleb said, "before you got back." Meg looked at him. "Clara had stepped out to check the stock. We were at the kitchen table. He was drawing brands again, the way he does." Caleb looked at the barn. He looked up and he said, "If you married my mama, would I call you Papa or Caleb?" And I said that was a question for further down the road, and he needed to be patient. He paused. He said he was being patient, that he'd been patient about this for a long time. Meg was quiet. "He said he'd been patient since he was 3, Caleb said. "Since he started understanding that other children had fathers and he didn't. He said 3 was a long time when you were only 5. Something moved through his voice, carefully contained. I didn't know what to say. I just told him I was working on it, that I was trying to be worth it." "What did he say to that?" Caleb looked at her. He said, "I already think you're worth it. I'm just waiting for Mama to figure it out." Meg pressed her lips together. "He's 5 years old," Caleb said quietly. "He's always been old for his age," Meg said. Her voice came out slightly unsteady, and she did not try to correct it. "He gets that from no one. He just arrived that way." "Meg," Caleb turned to face her. He said her name the way he said everything he meant, without excess, without softness as disguise, just the thing itself, accurate and direct. I'm not asking you to decide today. I told you that, and I meant it. But I need to say one thing, and then I'll stop. She looked at him. I spent 5 years on this land building something permanent, he said. I thought I was building it for myself, because I didn't know anything different. And then you walk through that door, with a satchel full of evidence, and a 5-year-old who reorganizes pantries. And I understood in about 24 hours that what I'd actually been building was a place that was waiting for people to come fill it. He held her gaze. You don't have to fill it in August. You don't have to fill it this year. But I need you to know that it's yours if you want it, both of yours, for as long as that means anything to you. He paused. That's all. The barn was quiet for a moment. Then Danny's voice came through the open door, telling magistrate something about biscuits, and the mare made the low sound horses made when they were listening, and the whole golden evening held still around it. Meg turned to face him fully. She thought about accuracy, about only accepting what she could verify, about the 8 days she had been here, and what those 8 days had demonstrated in evidence, not in declaration, not in promise, but in the demonstrated, repeatable, consistent behavior that was the only kind of evidence she had ever trusted. She thought about Danny at a kitchen table saying, I already think you're worth it. I'm just waiting for Mama to figure it out. She thought about what her mother had said at a kitchen table 30 years ago and never said again. I'm not waiting until August, she said. Caleb went still. I'm going to need you to be patient with the way I work, she said. I will correct you when you're wrong. I will not always stop working when you think I should. I will put Danny first in a way that has nothing to do with how I feel about you, and everything to do with who I decided to be when he was born. I know. And I will need you to tell me things directly, not around the edges of them. I don't function well around edges. I noticed. And I cannot promise that I won't sometimes be difficult and exacting and... Meg. His voice was quiet and stopped her mid-sentence with the specific accuracy of someone who knew exactly when enough words had been said. I know who you are. I've been watching who you are for 8 days with more attention than I've given anything in years. He took one step toward her. I'm not asking you to be less. I'm asking you to stay. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, counted them, let the count finish. Then she said, All right. He looked at her. All right. Don't make it larger than it is, she said. It's a beginning. We build from here. That's all I'm asking for, he said. A beginning. Danny came out of the barn at that precise moment, with hay in his hair and magistrate's lead rope in his hand, and the expression of a child who has been listening from around a corner and is not even slightly guilty about it.
Did you figure it out? He asked.
Meg looked at her son.
Were you eavesdropping?
I was listening, Danny said. There's a difference. There is not a meaningful difference. There is, Danny said. Eavesdropping is secret. I wasn't being secret. I just wasn't announcing myself. He looked between them with 5-year-old precision. Did you figure it out or not? Meg looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Meg. Yes, Caleb said. We figured it out. Danny considered this with the gravity he brought to all significant information. Then he nodded once, the conclusive nod, the one that meant the matter was settled and he was ready to move on to the next thing. Good, he said, because magistrate needs her water changed, and I can't reach the bucket. He turned and went back into the barn. Caleb looked at Meg. Meg looked at Caleb. Well, she said. Yeah, he said. And then, for the first time in 8 days, for the first time in 5 years, for the first time in all the distance she had put between herself and everything that frightened her, Margaret Calloway laughed. Not the polite professional sound she produced when social situations required it. Real laughter, unplanned and unmanaged, the kind that came from somewhere below all her careful architecture and proved there was still something there that could be surprised by joy. Caleb smiled, fully, finally, without the beginning of one quality she'd been observing for 8 days, and it was exactly as inconvenient as she'd suspected it would be, and she did not care at all. They went into the barn together to change the water for a gray mare named Magistrate, and Danny talked without pause about biscuits and brands and all the state capitals he had memorized while they were gone, and the Texas evening came on slow and gold outside the open door, and the land that had almost been stolen lay whole and unbroken in every direction, and the water ran cold and clear in the western quarter where it had always been, waiting for the people who knew how to fight for what was worth keeping. Some things were worth every mile, worth every hard word and every honest reckoning and every frightening moment of choosing to stay when leaving was easier. Some things were worth building from the beginning, carefully and truthfully, the way good things were always built, not from what was easy or what was safe, but from what was real. Margaret Calloway had spent 8 years finding the one mistake in fraudulent documents, the one thing that proved what was false. She had finally, at last, found the one thing that proved what was true, and she was not letting go of it.